Because I think too many people are surviving on pay which is unsustainable, which is going to embed them in poverty, really, and dependency. And I think it's really important that we emphasise that it's not just being employed that's the issue. When we look at employment figures and we see that employment's going up, it's what sort of jobs are people in, and are these jobs which are delivering them a fair wage that they can use for, planning and living rather than just existing. Yes, I mean, if you're taking the particular example of people who are working for Burberry in Treorchy, that type of factory work was always paid at minimum wage. People were not rich in that sense. They were hard-working people who got paid minimum wage, but what they had was full-time hours and predictability and what they thought was some security. So on that basis, you could plan, you could budget and you could plan. But coming out into the labour market, the people that replied to our survey were finding was that the jobs that were available for them were dominated by part-time work, dominated by temporary work, all at minimum wage. So they came out into a labour market where their skills were no longer seen as relevant. The experience that they built up inside the factory was seen as not transferable, and the structure of the jobs that they were able to apply for had changed, and so there was a deterioration in lifestyle, even where people found work and enjoyed that work, different work outside the factory. They didn't have as good conditions in terms of hours and pay as they had enjoyed before. Well, the businesses seem to justify everything under the heading of flexibility. They need flexibility, but they buy that flexibility through the use of people rather than skillful planning. Now, I'm sure that any manager or business leader would disagree with me fundamentally on that, but this is my interpretation of it, and I take a fairly robust stance, and I would be delighted to be proved wrong. But what I see in the way people are having to work is that hours of, between 0 and 30, how can that imply any serious planning of the use of the labour force there? Flexibility is being bought at the expense of the individual, and individuals are bearing all the risk of a 24/7 service. If in the old days, you might start on a temporary or part-time job to get a foot in the door with the objective of getting better trained, better skilled, and moving on to a permanent job or, higher numbers of hours. I'm sure that still does happen. I mean, the research shows us it does happen for some, but there's a creeping and steady, I think, change in attitudes whereby people are expected to take any work at any hours, at any wage rate, and be grateful for it. And it doesn't necessarily allow people to train. It doesn't necessarily allow them to develop themselves in any way. I mean, the research shows us that part-time work in Wales in particular suffers from a training deficit. That people are consigned to these hours, and that's where they stay. So you can't plan anything outside unpredictable hours. You can't plan education. You can't plan another job even. Yeah. So, I think all these things have to be taken into account. Well, I think they need to focus far more clearly on workers' rights as something which is not anti-competitive. You know, there's this image that workers' rights and unionisation and collective bargaining, all the stuff that delivered good employment conditions in the past, that is somehow no longer appropriate for this business model. And so you have workers unsure of their rights, unsure whether they can speak out, unsure whether they can ask for opportunities to train or for, you know, better hours or increased pay.